Hello everyone. Today I'm here to talk to you about the experience of giving birth to my daughter a few weeks ago in an NHS hospital. If you've been following my channel, you might know that I've already made a few videos about the NHS and the comparisons to a Korean hospital I went to a few months ago. I thought I might be able to add some useful observations from my stay to that series on healthcare. The night after my daughter was born, I spent sleeping in the maternity ward with my daughter next to me in a crib, and at I think about 2 o'clock in the morning, a doctor came in to tell me that they needed to take her away to give her a lumbar puncture procedure that they do to test spinal fluid or brain fluid. They suspected that she could have a bacterial infection of the brain, specifically meningitis. And so they wheeled her away to perform this procedure in a sterile environment that I was not allowed to join her. And for an hour, I was left on the ward to consider the fate of my family. Meningitis is a very fast-acting infection, and it's often fatal. And when it's not fatal, it very often leaves permanent side effects. I found myself praying to God for the first time in years, maybe over 10 years. I made a promise, more to myself than to any specific other entity, that if my daughter was safe, if she was healthy after all of this, that I would never be ungrateful again for my life. I promised that I would be thankful for every single day of my life after that. If only my daughter was healthy, then I would have no reason to be unthankful for anything in life. And maybe that sounds like a very strange bargain to make with God, but it seemed appropriate to me. And it wasn't exactly a bargain or a deal. It was more of a statement that if this one thing, if my daughter could only turn out all right after all of this, then I would have no reason to be ungrateful, because I would have everything that I needed. Right? No reason to be miserable again if only my daughter would be safe. And what that means for me as an atheist, as a non-believer, I think is a kind of interesting question that I haven't really been able to find an answer to, and I won't be making a video about that. I just wanted to start this video off by stating the stakes. What is at stake in this story? I want you as the viewer to understand the gravity of what I'm saying here. What I'm going to talk about in this video is not trivial, it's important. Even if you have private medical insurance in the United Kingdom, most private insurers will not cover anything to do with pregnancy or childbirth. It's part of the effect that I mentioned in my last video about the NHS, that is the first video, that the NHS providing a service for free, it doesn't just provide a competitor to private insurers, it also crowds out competition by providing this service for free to people. It actually disincentivizes competition, meaning that the number of choices that people in the UK have, if they do want to go private, the choices aren't the same as they would be if the NHS did not exist. So if you live in the UK and you are having children, the NHS is a fact of life, probably for you. And although there were a lot of good things about my stay in the NHS hospital and the treatment that I received and the treatment that my daughter received, there were also a few glaring errors that I think contributed to the possibility of my daughter contracting meningitis. She didn't, by the way. After 5 days in hospital, the results came back from that lumbar puncture, and it turned out she was okay, although we kind of suspected she was alright before that, but based on the fact that she wasn't presenting with any symptoms. But I want to start this story at the beginning, when I went into hospital, and talk about some of the errors that compounded on each other in order to result in this possible diagnosis of meningitis. While I was at home on maternity leave, I started having painful contractions that were irregular in their duration and their spacing and their severity, meaning that I was not in labour properly yet. I was advised to not come into hospital because I was not about to give birth. I was just having contractions, and it would be more comfortable for me to stay at home and manage the pain myself. So I did that for 2 days while these contractions were coming and going, and that was very tiring and painful. I couldn't go to sleep. So you can imagine after 2 days I was exhausted of not being able to sleep for 2 nights properly. And I was very relieved when my waters broke and I could then go to hospital and start having the baby. Entering the hospital, I think, is where the trouble started. Rather than taking me to the delivery ward and having me start the later stages of labour that would result in birth, as I'd hoped, even after my waters broke, my contractions were still not very regular, so they didn't want to start me going into labour yet. But they did make me aware that my waters breaking did start this sort of ticking time bomb, which was, it's the amniotic fluid in the womb that keeps the baby safe from infections. And when the fluid is released, the womb starts to dry up, and there's no barrier between the baby and the outside world, meaning that bacteria is free to travel between the womb and the outside world, meaning that the baby is now susceptible to getting an infection. So the policy of the NHS is to try to deliver the baby less than 48 hours after the water is broken to minimise this risk. And they also monitored my temperature to see if I was getting an infection. And that night that I spent in hospital, they came in and measured my temperature every few hours, and it was elevated a few times in a row. They took the measurement and I had a slight temperature. That was 18 hours after my waters had broken, by the way. I had to spend another night in the hospital before the birth had even started, because my contractions were still not regular. But while all of this was happening and while we were waiting, my husband and I were completely unaware that I was supposed to have been examined. That is to say, the physical examination of the birth canal and the how far along the baby's head had come down the passage. They were supposed to have done an examination to see how close I was to getting into the final stages of labour. Through some kind of error, I don't know at what point it was supposed to have happened, but it never happened. And the only time that I was examined was when I was already in the delivery room, and they had decided to induce the birth in order to mitigate this infection factor. That was the next morning. And just as they had decided to get me into labour one way or the other, that was the first time that I was examined, and they discovered that I was actually very far along in labour. And I was actually ready to start giving birth naturally. And we still don't know, and will never know, how long during that time that I was exhausted and in a lot of pain. We'd have no idea how far along I was in the labour process for that entire time. And although it would definitely have been nice to save myself all of that time spent in a lot of pain and exhaustion, more than that, it would have saved this massive risk factor that was exposing my baby to the infectious world, but before giving birth to her. Had I been examined earlier, I think it's pretty likely that they would have discovered that I was ready to give birth, and my daughter never would have been exposed to that long, dangerous period of being exposed to infections. They would have been able to deliver her sooner, and they wouldn't have had to give her that lumbar puncture and go through that procedure that I think was probably pretty stressful for her. And we wouldn't have had to spend the extra 5 days in hospital on antibiotics that they gave to her just in case that she had meningitis or some kind of other infection, which was a massive waste of NHS resources if that were the case. So what I'm trying to say is that a mistake was made. I don't know who made the mistake, which of the midwives or nurses or doctors was supposed to give me an examination, but not only did they neglect to do so, they also, there were no checks. Nobody after that point where I was supposed to have the examination checked whether or not I had been examined. It wasn't until I was in the delivery room being examined for the first time that they asked me whether I'd been examined previously to that. And that was the first time anybody had asked me that. Nobody else had checked that this thing that turned out to be quite important, they didn't check whether that had happened or not. All of these doctors and nurses and midwives who were treating me were very competent as far as I can tell, but the information being passed between them was incomplete, or it was not useful, or there was somehow a lack of information flow that led to this mistake. And these are the kinds of mistakes that happen all the time, and they can be minor or they can be severe, but they are astonishingly frequent. And not just in the NHS, but in other countries with different healthcare services, different healthcare systems. And it's enough to make me seriously consider perhaps having my next child at home. While it's true that my home does not have a lot of doctors walking around and has no medical equipment to speak of, at least the flow of information is completely static, and everybody in the room is completely aware of what is happening and what has happened. Having a single midwife who understands everything that's happened to me up to that point would probably help a lot. And all of this is just to say that providing free healthcare for all does not guarantee any standard of quality of that care, and it does not even guarantee that you will get that care. In my example that I've just described, everything that I received was free. I didn't have to pay for anything except for the parking, and yet I had no control over when I received that treatment. I had no control over who my doctor was or when I could see him. You can provide a treatment for free, but that doesn't matter if you can't get the treatment at the point that you need it, at the stage that you need it, or at the quality that you need it. It's possible that you can receive your treatment in a timely fashion, but often that just isn't the case in the NHS. You have to wait days or weeks or even months to see your doctor, to receive treatment sometimes. Depending on what the treatment is, I've heard of people waiting for years to receive it. And depending on what your condition is, waiting too long to receive treatment is the same as not getting it at all. If you can't get it when you need it, then in some cases you may as well not have it. And I'm absolutely not saying that there are any countries that are doing this right. There aren't any gold standard healthcare systems that I can point to and say they're perfect. Maybe that's just because I haven't done enough research. My criticism of the NHS is not a specific recommendation of another kind of system. It's only to say that making something free and putting more funding into it is not going to solve these problems. When you have these massive inefficiencies, such as the one I described, where a series of mistakes led to a superfluous stay in hospital 5 days for myself and my baby, adding extra funding won't help if it's not done intelligently. It's the incentives and the skin in the game that needs to be improved for these services to get better and to get safer for the patients. And again, I don't have any specific recommendations for how to do that. All I can say is that market pressures are very good at doing that. When customers can choose between a number of providers to make their own judgment of who is going to give them the best treatment at the best price, it provides a very good incentive to improve the quality of care and the price of the care as well. So if you are a believer in the NHS, or you're a supporter of free healthcare, then all that I ask of you is that you acknowledge that making something free does not mean that the product will remain the same. There's no one thing that we can call healthcare. But I think that's enough for today. So please leave your thoughts in the comments. I hope to be getting back to you with a new video pretty soon, so look out for that. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you around.